You can't really escape sequels. Once a developer has a good idea which sells pretty well, there's a natural desire to have some kind of follow-up, since we all have that inbuilt want to improve, and money is also nice, I guess. In a perfect world, you make a sequel and it's always better than the original. Some of the time this is correct, and other times the sequel is so good that you wonder what the hell was going on with the first game. Like, damn guys, did you learn that much, or were you holding back on us before? But then it goes in a different direction, where a sequel comes out, does really well, and nobody remembers or cares about the first game, even though that one's worth your time as well. Video games are so disposable these days, and sometimes when something newer and shinier comes out, there's a tendency for it to completely overshadow a fairly decent game. Fast forward years later, and who actually cares anymore? I guess this is a video about underrated video games, but specifically where an amazing sequel makes the original game look a little bit less appealing for whatever reason. I think it's more interesting to talk about cases where the first game is actually pretty decent, because then it becomes like, why was it overshadowed? Does it deserve it? I mean, probably, but that just makes it more fun. Competitive video games are tremendously expendable. Only a handful of titles ever reach the coveted inner circle of intense esports action, with big tournaments, massive rosters of professional players, and hundreds of thousands of people watching the live streams. It's an exclusive club, but goddamn if it isn't fun watching other games half-heartedly trying to get a piece of the action. Like the litany of mobile games, and Umbrella Corps tried this for a while. It didn't go well. I'm sure there was a reason why. Smash Bros went big on the competitive fighting scene around about the same time when Melee was at its peak, whenever that was. But enough people came along for the ride for it to be wildly popular at the highest level for well over a decade. It's a reasonably refined video game with hidden features for the aspiring player to master, and it's been well supported for a long time now. It's also a sequel, but you could have fooled me. To be fair to the original Super Smash Bros. Game, Melee absolutely annihilates it in every conceivable way. I don't even think it's a hardware issue. It's like Nintendo made a game for the N64 with a handful of their best characters, and then went fucking crazy for the GameCube and crammed this disc with so much more content. Luckily, this isn't a test of whether Melee is better than Smash Bros. On the N64, and more of an observation that while Melee has this massive dedicated fanbase these days, the original N64 game has been spectacularly forgotten by comparison. It's to be expected though, since Smash 64 didn't have the biggest budget, and given the strange concept of various Nintendo mascots beating the shit out of each other, Nintendo's confidence in it was low enough for Smash 64 to be a Japan-only game at the start. If Japan hadn't loved it as much as they did, it would have stayed there. But yeah, it's not a bad game at all, it's just a little light on the content. Still, Samus Aran hadn't been in a game for 5 years and made her 3D debut in Smash 64, so it deserves its pretty big place in history. Depending on who you ask and what part of EVA you're walking around at the time, there are some people who think that Smash Bros. Melee is one of the greatest games of all time, and that is very much debatable, but it just goes to show how hard Smash 64 would have to work to stay relevant. It started a massive series. It doesn't really need to do anything else. I'd like to retract my earlier comment about how competitive video games are only relevant until they bring out a new one, and upgrade it to encompass any multiplayer game ever made, especially online ones. The average shelf life of a multiplayer game has decreased over the years as the market becomes more and more oversaturated with similar video games being released faster than people can spend any decent time with them. It means that the consumer is on a constant lookout for a unique selling point that elevates one or a couple of games above the rest, and convinces you that this is where you should be spending your time. The kind of charm and character used in multiplayer shooters like Team Fortress 2 and Overwatch has allowed these games to attract fans from all sorts of different backgrounds, which in turn, alongside regular updates, safeguards them from suffering too many setbacks. Even at its lowest ebb, you could always find enjoyment in Team Fortress 2 by listening to the characters saying dumb shit and watching enemies explode like violent fireworks. There came a point in TF2's development where unrealistic gameplay had to be matched with cartoony graphics for everything to fit together nicely. This meant that Team Fortress 1 was left behind a bit. But then again, that was always likely considering that Team Fortress was just a mod for Quake, and Team Fortress Classic was just that same mod ported to Valve's new engine to promote Half-Life's development kit. So it was ambitious, but not too ambitious. The sequel went through 9 years worth of development where Valve meticulously refined how each character would look and act, and even though Team Fortress Classic is a very playable game, it just can't stack up against its louder, more colourful sequel. Despite the impossible uphill battle for popularity, Team Fortress Classic has its fans who still get a kick out of a slightly more realistic Valve multiplayer shooter which isn't called Counter-Strike. And I feel that a bit of polish applied to the graphics and a few of the mechanics would make it something even more worthy of your time. There's cause for optimism these days because Valve have recently remembered that Team Fortress 2 exists, so it's not as much of a stretch anymore. Baby steps, guys, baby steps. At some point, every big developer will have the open world dream, where they think to themselves, hey, why don't we take our big mascot character who's been in loads of different games up to this point, and put them in a larger overworld where everything is sort of connected. I like that, let's do that. And loads of developers have done this recently. I'm guessing this was kind of the inspiration behind Red Dead Redemption, but that was made by Rockstar, and they already knew what they were doing. Before I did any research, I thought Red Dead Redemption came about as a sequel to a game that not many people know about because of some kind of takeover. Like, some small studio makes Red Dead Revolver as a Wild West third-person shooter, runs out of money, only for Rockstar to swing in heroically to take the IP to exciting new heights, but this is not the case. As it goes, Red Dead Revolver had problems with development right up until it was released in 2004. Capcom were publishing the game until they cancelled it in 2003, only for Rockstar to take full control of the project and release it a year later. It came out after Grand Theft Auto had made the switch from top-down crime simulator to three-dimensional crime simulator. And that went pretty well, so why wouldn't every Rockstar game be like this? Red Dead Redemption overshadows Red Dead Revolver by a huge margin. Of course it's a better game because, unsurprisingly, 800 people working for 5 years on getting the absolute most out of an open world setting and a story that suits the tone the game is going for, tends to create one of the best games ever made. That's kind of how that works. But that's just it, isn't it? You stack most games against one of the greatest games of all time and they'll probably struggle for attention. You've only got to look at some of the games that have come out this year to see that. Given the focus that the Red Dead series has now, Revolver has very little chance of gaining someone's attention over games with such a large amount of fine-tuning. But the good news is that if this kind of game does seem inviting to you, Rockstar re-released it on the PlayStation Store for PS4 and it's quite cheap. So maybe being overshadowed has its benefits, weirdly. Remember that earlier comment about a game being overshadowed by a sequel because of some kind of takeover? Well, while that didn't apply to Red Dead Revolver, it most certainly applies to another sequel that most people don't process as a sequel. Dota 2, or Defense of the Ancients 2, is also a big game in the esports scene, and at times like this I realise that most of this video sounds the same, like I'm talking about roughly the same things all of the time, but the story behind Dota 2, and by extension Dota, is a lot more complicated, and kind of the reason why I never wondered why I've heard of the sequel but not the original. There's an interesting reason. Mostly because Dota 1 and Dota 2 are both MOBAs, and I kinda don't really care about MOBAs. Shooters get a lot of flack for all of them looking kinda the same, but you show me any footage from some random MOBA and I will struggle to care enough to find the difference between the two. So clearly, I am the right person to explain the controversy behind Valve's acquisition of the Dota brand. Everything in this video is related in some way. Actually, that line about all MOBAs being the same acts as an interesting subplot to the history of Dota 2. The original Dota came out in 2003 as a mod of Warcraft 3 and quickly established itself and its genre as a big deal that everyone should get involved with. I'm sure it's good, I'm not at liberty to divulge because this might be League of Legends for all I know. But then an interesting thing happened in 2009 when IceFrog, the designer behind Dota 1, was hired by Valve, the company with all the money. This led to Dota becoming Valve's intellectual property, and then Valve wanted a standalone sequel, and that's how we got Dota 2. But then there's another branch to this story. People who worked on Dota 1 went on to work on League of Legends, and I think some of them remade Dota 1 into something called Heroes of New Earth, which briefly had a large share of the market before Dota 2 landed and took it all away. Nowadays, Dota 2 has 7.5 million people playing it regularly, while the original Defense of the Ancients and Heroes of New Earth can barely crack 50,000. I'm sure they're all good in some way. Does Heroes of the Storm fit in here somewhere? I feel like it could if we tried hard enough. Contrary to all the stuff I've been saying in this video, it is possible for two great games to exist side by side without either one overshadowing the other. Think about Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, Pokemon Gold and Silver alongside Pokemon Red and Blue, Portal 1 and 2. All amazing games that showcase the wonderful work that a sequel can do without making the original irrelevant in every way. Though, when you put it that way, it almost sounds like sequels being too good is to the detriment of the original, and probably? I don't think Capcom cared too much considering what Street Fighter II did for that franchise. Really, if you want an example of how to start a series off on the right foot, this game right here. It does a lot of things right. Oh wait, this game came 4 years after the game that actually started off this franchise. Everyone remembers Street Fighter. Don't even get me started on Street Fighter 1. It's kinda weird though, since a lot of influential retro classics that have since been surpassed many times over by subsequent entries are still revered and remembered for the role they had in setting up the franchise so well, but Street Fighter 1 doesn't get this privilege. And I'd argue that it should, because it did a ton of work that Street Fighter 2 built up 4 years after. Capcom had never made a one-on-one fighter before this, and no one had made a fighting game that featured special attacks that required certain button inputs before Street Fighter showed them the way. Plus, you've got Ken and Ryu beating the crap out of a few of the regulars, so it's not too far removed from one of the greatest games of all time. But yeah, that's why. It's like Red Dead Redemption all over again, except Red Dead Redemption wasn't incredible at the perfect time or in a genre that was in need of a game to provide inspiration for numerous competitors over the coming decade. Street Fighter 1 helped out its sequel in a big way, but Street Fighter 2 provided the foundations for all fighting games that came after. I'd still argue that it deserves a bit more love, but the original is living in the shadow of an incredibly important game that spawned numerous updated versions that were ported to a load of consoles and basically every other fighting game after this. The interesting subplot to all of this is that the two people behind the first Street Fighter left Capcom after it came out, and then spent the 90s working for their direct competitors. There were a lot of fighting games in the 90s, I think they worked on most of them. You can take the designer out of Street Fighter, but you can't take Street Fighter out of the designer. This has been RabbidLuigi, and while it might not seem like the original Street Fighter gets the credit it deserves, or that it's being constantly overshadowed by its sequel, you gotta remember that the only way that Street Fighter 2 doesn't dwarf the original game is if it isn't very good, and I don't think that's the way to go. Without Street Fighter 1 being important and Street Fighter 2 being really fucking good, you don't get any of the high quality fighting games that came after, and I don't really want to do that. Like, what kind of world would we have then? All of the fighting game fans, they'd have to find something else to take way too seriously. Have you got an idea that you'd like me to turn into a countdown? Let me know in a comment down below, and make sure you check out my Twitter, where I'll be turning the best submissions into a poll where you can then decide the best topic. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.